What is populism? In this video, we will talk about how to define populism. We will go back in time and discover some classic papers that try to define populism in the 1950s. Before we do that, of course, we should ask ourselves, why should we actually care? So first of all, populism has certainly gained ground globally. And of course, recently we saw the re-election of Modi, and Modi arguably can be classified as a populist, at least by some academics. And we are delighted to witness very soon the second Trump presidency. Again, he is classified as a populist. Now, there is an emerging literature in economics that looks at the economic drivers of populism, such as inequality, globalization, and of course also increasingly the cultural factors. But this is not necessarily all done in economics. And the other strand of literature explores the economic impact of populism, in particular the impact on economic growth and institutions. My recent work belongs into the second category. So I also did ask myself, how should I define it? Because end of the day, if you don't really know what it is, you can't measure it. If you can't measure it, you can't do any quantitative analysis in a meaningful manner. Now, when I digged into the literature in economics, people tend to focus, of course, on more the economics type of literature, and they tend to ignore other areas, which is very common. So I read a little bit wider, and I came across the work by Alcock, published in 1971, and this paper referred to the paper by Schills, published in 1954, and many people argue that this was the first academic paper that tried to actually define populism. Alcock stated that the term populism is in a process of conversion. So that means actually nobody bothered defining it properly. It kind of emerges as a concept over time. But of course, that's a little bit messy and makes measurement quite difficult. So then I went into the original paper by Schills, which actually is quite difficult to find. I managed to find a copy of it thanks to actually a tweet, which I also uploaded to GitHub. So if you fancy reading it, which I highly recommend, you can just get it on my GitHub. The link is down below in the description. References I use are also down below in the description if you want to do some further reading. Now, in the case of Schills, the context is the US in the late 19th century. And arguably, in this period, the US also had a populist movement, the so-called People's Party, or sometimes called the Populist Party. This drives, to a large extent, the way Schills thinks about populism. So in a way, the starting point for his argument is we are in a liberal democracy, and we might deviate from it because of populism. Now, when you read other papers, in particular in economics, mostly influenced by the evidence in the 1980s in Latin America, it's quite different because they, of course, look at this, based on the historical context in Latin America, which basically means that populist movements there were mostly driven by issues around inequality, and populist leaders, usually left-wing leaders, focused on redistribution. So that was the main driving force. Now, this is, of course, entirely different from what you see nowadays in most populist movements, because they are not really driven as much by inequality. They are much more driven by cultural issues. And if you ignore this aspect, I think you just don't understand populism. And there are plenty of examples in the media where journalists all talk about, ways to fix populism simply by having more redistribution, having higher taxes on the so-called rich and so on, which, by the way, is actually quite difficult to do, and I did another video on this. But this is not actually addressing the issue, because they completely ignore the other dimension, and that's, these are the cultural aspects of it. The argument starts as follows. As a matter of fact, a liberal democracy depends on ideas. These are, number one, liberty. Without liberty, there is no democracy. Equality, in the following sense, in moral dignity. And this is really important. It's not equality in terms of economic outcomes. This is very, very different. It's not equity as such. It's equality in moral dignity. And then, most importantly, the supremacy of the law, the rule of the law, limiting the power of the state. And fundamentally, these ideas, they live in an equilibrium. There's, of course, conflict, but of course, in the end, you have to balance these different elements. And populism might change this balance. So that's the main argument of the paper. Now, this is the paper on populism and the rule of law. Now, in my view, when you read this paper, it's quite amazing that many elements of it fit really, really well into the current debates you see across the globe. So citizens must believe in the legitimacy of institutions. So that is absolutely fundamental. And of course, we have seen in particular in the COVID period that this really undermined to a large extent legitimacy and trust. And this is definitely, I think, a major reason why we now see this significant dominance of populist movements. Now, the main issue arises with this combination of distrust and a belief in general moral superiority. And of course, you see this in the current debate about populism, but also, I think, as a response to wokery, because wokery to a large extent is all about the belief to be morally superior. To be very clear, wokeism, so to speak, is driven by the elite and not the people for sure. And you might argue that populism is a counter movement against wokeism. Distrust is good. You should distrust to some extent politicians and institutions. You should question them. But of course, you can push it too far, where literally you don't believe anything at all, which becomes, of course, then also an issue. To give power back to the people, as, for example, the initiative, the referendum and the recall. That's exactly what, of course, happened, take back control in the case of the Brexit debate. So that's an interesting element to that. And then it talks a lot about the leadership of populist movements, the great orator, the spellbinders, so to speak, who denounce the mighty for their might and their sins, and who praise the people for their simple virtue and honorable wisdom. Populism identified the will of the people with justice and morality. And I think this is really a nice description of what we observe currently across the globe. And for me, it's remarkable that this was written in the 1950s. And that's also a nice quote here. Populism is tinted by the belief that the people are not just the equal of their rulers, they're actually better than their rulers. And you actually hear this all the time when you just open up YouTube, lots of discussions around that, how rotten the elite is, how corrupt, and so on. And the next element is also really interesting. It's about identity and representation. So summing up, this is quite a remarkable paper to read. So what do we get out of it? Can we actually derive a definition? So in many ways, from this paper, you obtain the following insight. Populism is an anti-political tradition where distrust, useful of course to keep power in check, mixes with an assumption of a general moral superiority. This makes it difficult to maintain the division of powers or the rule of law. So that's fundamentally the essence of it. The other element which I quite like in Qirs is the idea that, of course, on the surface, it's about the people against the corrupt elite, but he already argues that some of it might be just a counter-elite, so an elite within the elite who uses the will of the people to take power. So that's an interesting observation. Based on Qirs, populism proclaimed that the will of the people, as such, is supreme over every other standard, over the standards of traditional institutions, over the autonomy of institutions, and over the will of other strata. Now, in terms of how we measure populism in the literature, we focus exactly on these elements. So one element is anti-establishment, so anti-elite. The other element is anti-pluralism. Yeah, it's not about, hearing the voices of minorities and all of that. In general, it's not about, in fact, much disapproval, which is not really encouraged. So these are the two elements which are used to quantify populism. So what happens in terms of measurement is you go through the text, so the political agendas, speeches of political leaders, and you try to classify them based on these two main terms, anti-establishment, anti-pluralism. And this gives you a way to measure whether a leader is more or less populist. The other thing which I think is important to note, and again, this is not the case in many newspaper articles, populism is fundamentally what Mudde said, a thin-centered ideology. So it's not really a proper ideology. It's more a theory of society, where society can be split neatly into two homogeneous groups, the people and the elite. So that's fundamentally at the heart of it. The next point I think is important, in particular if you want to understand the economic consequences of populism. Also in the work I'm currently doing, we try to identify left and right-leaning populism because in a way it matters who the enemies of the people are supposed to be. Quite often the enemies of the people are the big corporations, the banks. But it's also possible, depending on the respective movement, that the enemies of the people are religious minorities or immigrants and so on. So that I think is an important distinction, and in our work we actually show it makes a big difference in terms of the economic outcomes. In summary, I strongly believe that we should care about definitions because we have to define things before we can measure them. And we have to remind us that any measurements we take are not perfect. And we should be very reluctant to believe in empirical findings without questioning the ways we measure. So I hope you enjoyed this little video, and I see you in the next one.